Shalom, everybody. Shavua Tov. Good morning. Nice to see you all. Just a word of introduction before I hand it over to Rabbi Roth. We're really grateful to have had Rabbi Daniel Roth teaching for us 4 sessions. This is the 4th of 4 sessions, though. Don't worry if you missed the first 3 because they stand independently, but you can check those out. We record them, and these sessions have been all mining the wisdom of the work that Rabbi Roth does in the world in negotiating conflict resolutions in a specific way, third-party religious mediators, kind of back channel mediators, and Rabbi Roth is the director of Mosaica and does that work through that organization, or as part of that organization, has a doctorate in peace studies and conflict resolution, and has shared a lot with us about his work and about that work in general, and then some of and this is part of why we asked Rabbi Roth to give us this perspective, some of his work specifically in thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which seems to us so intractable and so frustrating, and we as a Jewish community feel tethered to in all kinds of different ways. So that's been just valuable already. So such insight. There aren't that many voices that we trust, to think through these issues with us, and Rabbi Roth is one. I always, at the end, though, as I introduce Rabbi Roth, that's been our focus. But I have to say, first of all, I have to say that he's a dear friend and family member to Ikar, and that's true too. He's Hannah Roth's brother, but also and has taught at Ikar many times before. So he has become a voice we trust. But also, I always say, and because of my work in the world and what I have connected to, I always say that Daniel Roth is also just a good old-fashioned Talmud Torah teacher, and actually I say that again this time because that's actually what we're going to look at this time. Our focus this time is going to be some of the work that I first became aware of Rabbi Roth through the work of a particular Jewish textual methodology called Machloket Matters. I heard about this program, became interested in this program, and only then came to know the fullness of Rabbi Roth's work. So without further ado, that is to say, we're gonna have a little bit of exposure to what our tradition, Torah, Jewish text, and the particular dynamics in Jewish text have to do with all of this thinking about conflict resolution. And the last thing I'll say is the obvious, which is at this moment in the world, it's a scary time, and as war builds in this kind of looming, frightening, potentially massive in its implications way, it feels at this moment like conflict resolution, like there's something so familiar about war brewing, and also something so absurd about it. It feels like, isn't there a way to talk through this? So it feels at this moment like conflict resolution is about the most important thing in the universe. So I'm really grateful to have this space this morning to process these kinds of things, and to process them through my own tradition is a special blessing. So without further ado, Rabbi Daniel Roth.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you so much again for the Ikar community for inviting me to be, as you said, a trusted voice, and to learn these really, really difficult topics in a thoughtful way, and from different angles. So, as those of you who have been with me, I'm gonna like to pull up a PowerPoint and do some a little bit of frontal conversation, then open up for conversation. So this is our 4th session of what we're calling Engaging the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict as Insider Religious Mediators. Those of you who are with me and don't remember, or were not with me, I'll quickly recap that I had the privilege of being in an in-person event in LA, in Ikar. What a crazy idea. Not just over Zoom. In the end of October, and there I got to share about what's going on as of then, right now, in terms of advancing this back channel of insider mediation in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more as we're preparing for what happens this coming Ramadan, and as Passover and Ramadan coincide, and then Remembrance Day for fallen Israeli soldiers and Eid al-Fitr are going to fall on the same day. So we have a lot of things that we're working on over this coming month and a half to try to do little things like try to prevent holy war in the Holy Land. Nothing big. Then we moved on to a little bit more of like a historical Jewish text, and I shared with you some parts of my book, Third-Party Peacemakers in Judaism, which, Andrew, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there might still be some copies someplace in Ikar. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book at the very, very end as we wrap up. And then our third session, we looked a little bit historically over the last 20 years of who have been some of these hidden, out of the public eye, insider religious mediators that had been secretly negotiating between Hamas and Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And how does that work? What does it mean for liberal peacemaking to not be replaced, but to expand to what might be referred to as illiberal peacemaking? And today I want to frame the question as, how can each of us serve as insider mediators in the context of the conflict? And I think we have to add that as and in general. I mean, as Rabbi Kasher mentioned, like, we're in a moment of trauma. Like, I don't know how, I mean, I feel like I'm not sleeping, and I feel like it's, it's just, we're just consumed with what's going on, and so troubled and so bothered. So I can't only talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have to talk about conflict in general. But what role can we play, if any, and not, in any particular conflict, but in serving as insider mediators? Okay, what does that mean? And in order to do that, I want to introduce you to a particular lens of reading Jewish text that, as Rabbi Kasher mentioned, I developed over many years teaching at the Pardes Institute, but now plays a really important tool in helping prepare myself for facilitating pretty difficult conversations between real enemies, and for preparing my team to be ready for those, and for those that we're engaging. So those of you with me in the first session, I shared with you my personal, as a personal story, like just my passion for machloket, for disagreement, is what kind of got me into this work. This scene of 1993 when the Oslo Accords were being signed, and watching my rabbis argue for and against, and introduce very, very different voices, and say, vote for who you're going to vote for, demonstrate for who you're going to demonstrate for. You make sure to understand entirely the way the other side is looking at it. And that experience, as I described to you, was like pulling a muscle in the brain, of stretching. And it connects to the essence of Jewish text, which is all about disagreement for the sake of heaven. It's all about understanding opposing ways of looking at things. And I'll talk about why the number 49 in a moment without going into too much detail. But for years and years, I had the opportunity to kind of teach Talmud and biblical studies through this lens of mediation, through this lens of contradictory narratives. And then we developed it at Pardes into what's called Machloket Matters. And I'm very happy that even though I'm no longer a faculty member at the Pardes Institute, it is continuing to grow and grow. And communities all across America and campuses all across America are continuing to use this methodology. And I developed 5-6 units with videos, etc., known as the Beit Midrash way. I want to focus in and do one little example, because I don't want to go too much just in depth into the text, because I want to leave time for conversation. What I'm calling fear, war, or trust, peace. Okay, Unit 2, from Jacob and Esau through Chamberlain and Menachem Begin to today, like literally
Rabbi
today.
Roth.
You can't see anything, can you?
Yeah. I think this happened once before. I think when I assume you're scrolling through, but when you do the screen share on a PowerPoint, it only grabs the first often. So you may have to share and unshare. Yeah, now we see something different.
Okay. Yeah. Here's my picture.
Yeah, when you said 49, I was like, oh, he must be showing the number 49, but we weren't seeing that.
Oh my gosh, don't know why that happened. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. Right. So I was mentioning that I want to take just one example that I actually have found of the 5-part series that I developed to be the most helpful tool in framing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in my work, and in framing difficult, intractable conflicts in general. It might be true also for the Ukrainian, Russian, how we're engaging that as well. So again, I'm calling it from Jacob to Esau through Chamberlain and Menachem Begin to today. Also note, as you can see, just under that little logo, that little design of the Beit Midrash Way, the 9 Adar project, which I launched at first in Ikar like 9 years ago. It was the first place I ever talked about it, was actually at Ikar Synagogue, which we just commemorated recently in Israel. We had over Mosaic, we had about 200 events all over the country with rabbis and sheikhs and our 70 mediation centers. So it's important for me just to note that I see our final session as being so fitting that it connects into that, all those events taking place. The framing text that I have found to not be so well known. Okay, those of you who were with me, and I mentioned about the stories of the Chida, and I said he's like in the top 200 rabbis, and I want to get him into the top 5. But I think this text of the Memtet, the 4949, is not very well known, not as well known as these and those are the words of living God, or there's 70 faces to Torah. But I love this text as a framing text for understanding disagreement and narrative conflict. I'm not going to read it inside. I'm going to tell it over my own words and explain why this is going to be a lens through which we're going to read the conflict story. There's different versions of this ancient legend. I took from the Midrash on Psalms, but it's always brought in the name of Rabbi Yanai, 3rd century, living in the land of Israel, where he says that when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, he asked God for a clear-cut Torah. Keep it simple. Tell me what you want. And God says, I'm not going to give you a clear-cut Torah. If I give it to you too straightforward, it'll be too rigid of a tradition. No foot will be able to stand up. It'll be too rigid. Instead, I'm going to give you a Torah that on every single line and every law, you have to be able to read it with 49 reasons to explain why something should be permitted, and 49 reasons why that exact same thing should be forbidden. 49 reasons why it should be pure, and 49 reasons why the exact same thing should be impure. And live with the contradiction, live with the complexity, and then after everybody sitting around the room can understand the contradictory ways of reading that text, then you're going to take a vote. If the majority says the thing is allowed, it's allowed. If the majority of you say it's forbidden, it's forbidden. But the majority is going to get to decide. But you only get to vote if you understand deeply the opposing side. It's almost a condition for voting that you understand the contradictory way of looking at the text and looking at the reality. And that, for me, like reading it 49, 49 being almost full 50 of truth, right? 50 being like Shavuot or the 50 gates of wisdom that they talk about. 50 in rabbinic theology is the absolute. It's the place of no return. It's completeness to the beyond the point of curiosity. And 49 is, I have a lot of reasons why I'm right. That's a lot of reasons. But I have also a crack in my narrative that allows for a little bit of curiosity that maybe there's another way to look at this. So when you read a biblical story or you read a Jewish legal concept or debate, there is a concept that you have to read it through contradictory lenses. And there's stories that they say that even young children used to have to learn to read the Bible through the 49, through contradictory ways of looking at it. And as I said, a condition for being a member of the parliament, of the Sanhedrin, was you had to be able to prove that you could do the 49. So for me, so much of my work is how do you transition people from thinking of a 50-0, I have absolute complete truth, they have nothing that I can learn about. The only reason why I would engage in this conversation with you is just to basically prove why you're wrong. But I have zero interest in learning anything you have to say. And I'm not talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm not talking about Russia, Ukraine. I'm talking about any conflict. I'm talking about Hillel and Shammai, okay? The definition of a disagreement for the sake of heaven, a sacred disagreement, according to certain interpretations, is when people are coming in with a 49 and then vote and advocate for your truth, but know that there might be some wisdom with those you disagree, versus the 50-0, that if each side comes in with a 50-0 mindset, that I have the complete truth and you have nothing, the chances of that will be a constructive, sacred disagreement are slim. Okay, so we're going to use that as a lens. This is a text about disagreement for the sake of heaven. You can learn more about this by Googling disagreement for the sake of heaven, the story of Nine Adar. Story of Nine Adar, by the way, what was the story of Nine Adar? Those of you who were with me 9-10 years ago when I talked about it at Ikar, you must have all remembered that, was the day that Hillel and Shammai and their schools of thought, their political parties, stopped engaging in constructive disagreement, took weapons into their parliament and killed each other. And that was the end of the constructive disagreement, the sacred disagreement between them. It would be known, unfortunately, now as the January 6th of Rabbinic Judaism. Okay, and it's a fast day, etc. But I don't want to talk theory of this idea. I want to implement it. And we're going to do this kind of fast because I want to really allow time for questions and engage on a very here and now basis, not just around the text. But I want to do one example of reading a biblical conflict through the lens of 49, and then what are the implications for our ability to serve as mediators today, in particular the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Okay, I see text study as part of conditioning the brain, literally flexing the brain's ability to engage in difficult narrative conflicts. So the question that was asked in the Beit Midrash, okay, like the Talmud says, Ibailahu, a question was raised in the Beit Midrash. When should we trust the sincerity of our enemies' intentions to make peace? And when should we not? And we can ask, when you think of that question, what is the context that comes to mind? Okay, I'll let people, Andrea, people can unmute themselves. We're an intimate group. What comes to mind when you think of when should we trust the sincerity of our enemies' intentions to make peace, and when should we not? Any conflict going on, what might be a context where that question would be an important question to ask?
Might you say, can we sit down and talk about this?
Yes, but I'm asking, give me a context of a conflict context, an actual conflict. When would this question be a question that you need to ask?
Well, anytime there's a disagreement, obviously.
Yeah, I understand. Right. So I'm
Sorry.
saying like,
Obviously.
Right. No, I'm saying, but even more concrete, like that was the question that was happening last week when Macron was trying to convince, sit down and talk to Putin. Well, wait a minute. Let's say he wants, but can we trust it? Or is it actually just a way of buying time? Or, meaning on a very concrete level, this question will come up in so many conflict contexts right? It can come up, as we'll talk about in, we have also going on right now. I should ask, which conflict's happening today in the news? This is the Ukrainian conflict. If Putin and Zelensky sit in Belarus, can he even trust what's happening there? Or is it just like a way of buying time to just, it's just being cynical? There's about to be a signing of America and Iranian nuclear agreement. Can you trust that or not trust that? Meaning this question will come up in lots of conflict contexts. So what I find to be very helpful is let's take a step back from what's going on in our reality of the news right now, and let's flex the brain in a biblical context, okay? So the one that I find that this question comes up is in one little passage of the story, which is a long story of the Jacob and Esau conflict, which is a long, long conflict. We're just gonna zero in on one little scene, which I like to call, when you read a biblical text that tells over a biblical conflict, you are reading the shared facts that all commentaries agree upon. They agree that these words are written. That is a fact. What the meaning of these words are is going to be disputed for a couple thousand years. Okay, so the scene is, and again, I apologize that we're going to do this not the way I would do it if we were sitting for 3 hours in a tech study, but I want to. We're going to do this as a short text study. Okay, the scene is the beginning of Parshat Vayishlach, chapter 32 in Genesis. What I like to do is give the Hebrew in the middle and two very different translations, let's say an Art Scroll and a JPS, meaning from different contexts themselves, of how is even on the level of translation, ambiguity in the conflict is already going to be important to note. So I think what I'm going to do in the interest of time is I'm going to read you the text from the JPS version. Okay, what I want you to think about as I go through is what's unclear in the facts. What are the major questions in this conflict scene that's important to understand? So the scene says as follows: Jacob sent messengers ahead to his brother Esau to the land of Seir, the country of Edom, and instructed them as follows: Thus shall you say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I stayed with Lavan and remained until now. I have acquired cattle, asses, sheep, and male and female slaves, and I send this message to my lord in the hope of gaining your favor. The messengers returned to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau. He himself is come to meet you, and there are 400 men with him. Jacob was greatly afraid in his anxiety. That's the whole scene I want us to look at. Okay? There's slight differences between translations, but what I want to get at here is what is clear and unclear in this little biblical passage. Okay? We're intentionally walking into the middle of a long conflict. It's fun when people don't know anything about this story, because that's what often happens with people trying to mediate other people's conflicts. They walk right into the middle. They don't know what's about to happen, what happened, and what's the context. So what do we have going on in this story? Jacob is sending messengers, right, to his brother. The messengers come back and they give him a message. What is unclear? What's unclear about this story? What is ambiguous? What do we need to know to understand?
Were they messengers, humans, or angels was the first thing.
So who are these messengers? The Hebrew word being malachim, which in biblical Hebrew could mean angel or just a regular human messenger, right? What else?
We don't know what Esau's intentions are.
Well, is it a field or a country?
We don't know why he has 400 men with him.
Okay, so we have as a fact that the messengers say he has 400 men with him. But what don't we know? What are his intentions, right? Why is he coming with 400 men? Is he always hanging out with 400 men? Is it just something like that he just happens to be with his 400 best friends and he's, and we bumped into him? Okay, what is his intention? How does Jacob understand his intentions? What is Jacob's response to hearing this message that his brother Esau is coming with 400 men?
He thought the worst.
That is not ambiguous. That's exactly right. Meaning Jacob is terrified. If he was a little bit scared beforehand about meeting his brother, now he is trembling. That is totally clear, right? What else is unclear about this text? How does Jacob refer to his brother? What's he call his brother? His twin brother, mind you.
My Lord.
Yeah. I like to ask, like, are there any twins in the Zoom right now? Like, do you refer to your twin as my Lord? Right? Notice, how do the messengers, though, refer to Esau? We came to your, they say we came to your brother.
Yeah.
But Esau himself refers to him as my Lord. I'm his servant. There's like this very clear hierarchy of power that's going on here between the two sides. So, so there's a lot of different questions that come up, even in this little text, okay? Who are the messengers? Why is Esau coming with 400 men? By the way, did the messengers actually, notice who has no lines if we were to script this as a play? Who doesn't have any lines in this scene?
Esau.
Esau has no lines, meaning what did he actually say? Did they meet with him? What did he tell them? We only know that the messengers come back and said he's coming with 400 men. So there's three different characters going on in this scene that this is very important to understanding in conflict analysis. You have Jacob, who's one side. You have Esau, who's another side, and you have the messengers who are going back and forth between the two. Okay? And who's understanding what's happening in this dynamic of this almost encounter between them? Okay? So I want to, again, if what I like to do, and I apologize because I want to make sure that we get into some of the deeper conversations about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, etc. I'm going to shorten this, but sometimes it's fun if you do a Machloket Matters with Rabbi Kasher here. I'll put it on him as an Ikar learning experience. You can do this more properly, no pressure. But I like to do like, what's your intuitive tweet? Okay. What's your intuitive tweet? Intuitive tweet is like what the commentaries would do, what Rashi and everybody did. They would write down one line of what they think they just saw in that scene. So, and then that gets like stuck for like 1,500 years, not on like, and read over and over. You cannot erase what Rashi just tweeted out as a commentary. So if like, when you read that scene, how do you understand Jacob's fears? Is Esau really coming with ill intent? Is Jacob just paranoid? Like, what would you be tweeting about if you were, looking at this and watching Jacob get nervous? You're welcome to put it into, to take a moment and put it into the chat box, without thinking too deeply. You just found out Esau's coming with 400 men and they're going to meet. What do you think? What are you thinking about about Jacob's, feeling What's the feeling going on at this scene? I'll give you I'll give a moment if anyone wants to be creative and try to write something into the chat, so I don't totally do this too fast. So Janet, you wrote 400 men start worrying. Okay. Ruth, watch out. Jacob, holy cow. Okay, so we're scared. Anyone else? Yes? You have to unmute.
He divided his camp into destruction. So
Yes, that's what he's going to do. That's what he's going to do. But I'm asking at this particular scene, at this particular moment, if you were going to tweet what's going on here, Teresa, hide your wives, hide your kids, Asa coming for. So everybody's reading this as this is pretty scary. Okay, this is scary. This is a scary moment. Beware. And no one is seeing Jacob as paranoid. Nobody. Okay. So I want to invite in two, they're not tweets, they're like more like posts because they're a little longer. Okay. I'm going to invite in two medieval commentaries or two traditional commentaries that looked at the exact same scene. And we're going to look at it through the 4949. The first is the Abarbanel, Don Isaac Abarbanel. Okay. And this is what he wrote when he saw this text, okay? And he is coming towards you. And it seems from the messengers that they did not know Esau's hatred towards Jacob. And so when they went to him and spoke to him regarding their mission, he replied to them, behold, he is coming toward you. And they thought he was coming toward him to honor him. Because of this, they went back to Jacob and said to him, we came to your brother, to Esau, meaning, why should you call him my master, my lord? And he is none other than your loving, loyal brother. And behold, he is also coming toward you, meaning it is not enough that he should receive your messengers, but he himself is going and coming toward you to receive you, and 400 men are with him to honor you. But Jacob, who knew the truth, and knew about Esau's wickedness, he alone was not convinced of this matter and was very afraid of his coming and concerned about the 400 men he was coming with, because he knew that he was coming for the purpose of war. Now, let's unpack what the Abarbanel just offered us here. As I said, there's three different sides in this conflict scene. Okay? How does Jacob interpret the intentions of Esau coming with 400 men? Why is he coming with 400 men? He's coming for the purpose of war. That's clear. The text tells us that. How do the messengers, according to the Abarbanel, understand what Esau's intentions are? Why is he coming with 400 men? You're welcome to unmute yourself.
to honor him.
He's your loving brother. It's a 400-man honor guard. Why are you getting paranoid? They're coming because he loves you. He doesn't want to just show up and just have a cup of coffee after not having seen you for 20 years. He's getting a banquet hall with 400 of his jolly men, and they're all going to celebrate and dance with you. What are you so nervous about? But what were Esau's actual intentions according to the Abarbanel? Was he coming to honor him, or was he coming to kill him? According to the Abarbanel, he's coming for the purpose of war. Why did Jacob know the truth and the messengers misinterpreted what was happening in this particular situation. What did Jacob have that they don't have?
Guilty
Guilty conscience.
History.
Jacob has a guilty conscience. Jacob knows that Jacob knows, according to the Barbanel, he knows that Esau is his wickedness. He knows that he refers to several 5 chapters earlier, that the last thing he heard was that when Esau screamed out, when I have the chance, I'm going to kill him. For 20 years, Esau has been hiding from his brother who wants to kill him. Did he tell the messengers that he kind of dressed up and stole the birthright and then traded the blessing for a cup of soup, all that? Probably not. So he, maybe because of his guilty conscience, he didn't tell them. But he has information, critical information of the history of their conflict the messengers don't have. 2 twin brothers, they haven't seen him for 20 years. All of a sudden, one is coming with 400 men. Why even assume any ill intent? They're coming to get together. What's the problem? The Barbanel says, listen, Jacob had critical information that he knows the history of the conflict. They have a bad history. Esau is a dangerous person. He's not just a nice twin brother. And he knew not to trust him. He was correct, and the messengers were naive. They just simply didn't know the history of the conflict. They thought that he was coming for the purpose of peace when he was really coming for the purpose of war. That is the Barbanel's take on the story we just read. A couple hundred years later comes along another biblical commentary named Shmuel David Latzato, the Shadal. And the Shadal reads almost the exact same thing as the Barbanel, except it's the opposite. The Shadal says the following, and he's coming toward you, for they believe that Esau was only coming to honor and protect him on his way. Meaning the messengers are saying he's coming towards you. Why is Esau coming towards you? Because he loves you. He's coming to meet you. And then the Shadal adds, and perhaps this really was Esau's intention, that Esau himself was actually coming out of love, out of brotherly love. And perhaps they also understood from Esau's answer that he did not have in his heart any evil or hatred for his brother. And perhaps they also told Jacob all these things, that he said to them words of peace and brotherhood. However, Jacob did not trust all of this, for he was afraid when he heard that he was coming with 400 men. And scripture did not want to expand upon the conversation of Esau and the messengers, since they did not have any benefit in him, because Jacob did not trust them. So watch what's happening here. 3 different parts of the conflict, 3 different parties. You have Jacob. He clearly is interpreting the intention of Esau as coming for the purpose of war, to come and kill him. That's clear. The question is he interpreting the reality correctly or not? The messengers, according to the Shadal, are just like a Barbanel. They understand that Jacob is not your Lord and you're his servant, but that he's your brother and that he's coming because he loves you. He's going to embrace you. He's going to kiss you. There's no harm. And actually, this was Esau's intention. They understood Esau's intention, but Jacob couldn't believe that he was actually coming for the purposes of peace. What's blinding Jacob's ability to see the reality that Esau is not coming to kill him, that Esau is actually a true loving twin brother, that he's coming to give him a hug and not to hurt him? Why is Jacob incapable of seeing that this is not a moment of war? This is a moment of peace. What's blinding Jacob?
Guilt?
His guilt. What else? What is he? Why do the messengers able to see that this is really peace? Is that it's his guilt from all that history. He's got the history for the Shadal and his own guilt and everything that happened is blinding Jacob from seeing what's happening right now. He's living in previous traumas. But the Esau of 20 years ago, who said he's going to kill you, is not the same Esau we just met. This is a brother who's coming to love you. And these 400 men are coming to protect you on your way, not to kill you. But Jacob couldn't trust that. So who's right? The Abarbanel, who on the one hand, he's arguing Jacob read it right. Esau's coming to kill you. The messengers are naive. You know why they're naive? Because they don't know the history of this conflict. They just walked into the middle of a very complicated relationship. And they just think that when somebody comes with 400 men, it means it's good news. But Jacob knows. And the Shadal says, no, Jacob, he's stuck in his previous traumas of so much fear that he can't imagine a moment that could be peaceful and coexist. And the messengers who don't have that trauma are incapable of convincing him to trust and not constantly fight. So who's right? The Abarbanel or Shadal? Now, what's so interesting to me, and this is why this story is so important to me, is that I don't think it's a coincidence that the Abarbanel and Shadal are reading the exact same biblical story in opposite ways, because they lived in totally different historical contexts. And this is very important to understand. The Abarbanel, very briefly, right? When did he live? He lived in the expulsion of the Jews from Portugal and then the Jews from Spain. He was the head of the Jewish community in Portugal, very close to the king. And then he ran away and he went to they plotted against him. I'm sorry, I reversed it. My apologies. His family was originally from Portugal, but he grows as the treasurer in Spain. He's close with Ferdinand and Isabella, and he's working with them every day as their treasurer. And then he finds out that they're going to expel the Jews of Spain. He does every single thing possible he's convinced that they're not going to do it. He's convinced that there's no way they would be crazy enough to expel all their Jews. Can't happen. So he negotiates with them. He tries to persuade them not to do it. He succeeds in just having it pushed off by 3 days. And there he goes as a refugee with hundreds of thousands of other Jews as refugees along the coast of Spain. No community takes him in until he gets to Italy. He gets to Naples. In Naples, they find out that the most brilliant economic mind is on the boat. They invite him in with the other people on his boat. He serves the king. And then for a third time in his life, somebody who he's in a close relationship with stabs him in the back, and he has to go fleeing for his life until he gets to Venice. And when he gets to Venice, he writes his commentary on the Bible, and he more or less retires from politics. He does one more mediation between the Venetians and the Portuguese because he knew both sides, but is not successful. But in terms of advocating for the Jewish people, he gave up. He does not trust Christian kings. Every time they tell him this time it's going to be different, they stab him in the back. How come we know this? Because there was a famous Jewish historian who wrote about the Abarbanel, and his story, his name is Ben Sion Netanyahu. Anyone ever hear of Ben Sion Netanyahu? He wrote his PhD on the Abarbanel. And he argues that the Abarbanel was actually quite a naive mediator. That the Abarbanel believed that you can negotiate with the bad guys. He literally writes this as a historian in the 1950s. It was later published in English in 1968. But Ben Sion Netanyahu, who himself escaped the horrors of Europe and did his PhD in Penn, he writes, again, I don't have time to read this through inside, but he basically argues that he says, if I read one line, significantly, he was described as one who mends the breaches. The Abarbanel always believed you can reconcile the sides, but the breaches could not be mended. And it is here where Abarbanel's great error lay. When all his experience in politics, his analytical mind, and his vast knowledge of human affairs, he saw the world through a veil. That the veil was removed from time to time. And the Barbanel's genius is, he basically says he did not save the Jews of Europe because he was naive. So the Abarbanel himself later in life becomes a realist. Don't trust. When they say they're coming in peace, don't believe them. It's going to be a trap. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he joins a very Beitar right-wing Zionist movement and has a slight influence on his son, Bibi Netanyahu's way of looking at the world, which is when they say they're coming in peace, don't trust. Because it could be a trick. And those who say trust, you have PTSD, you have all this trauma, Holocaust trauma and war trauma and all. He says, don't tell me, I know when the bad guys say they're coming to kill me, I trust them. You're the one who's naive, not me. The Shadal lives in the exact opposite reality. The Shadal lived at a time in Italy where Jews are getting citizenship, where the ghettos had just been taken down, where he is, as an Orthodox rabbi, is reinterpreting Jewish law to be more universalistic, that Jews and non-Jews should be treated equally, just the way he's being treated equally. And I think that the Abarbanel is looking around and saying, you guys who are not able to trust the non-Jewish world are stuck in your psychological ghettos of fear. That the non-Jews of Italy today are not the same. They're not the same non-Jews, the same Christians that had fought with us and the same children of Esau that had hurt us. But there's an opportunity here for something different. And you know who one of the world's experts on the Shadal is? It's somebody who Rabbi Brous mentioned when we first started this series, a man named Rabbi Dr. Mark Gopin, one of the founders of religious peace building, who wrote his PhD about Shadal as a young rabbinic student, of a concept of a model of a rabbi from a couple hundred years ago who saw that Jewish, non-Jewish relations could be totally different. And Mark, who deeply believes in religious peace, saw the Shadal as a precursor towards Jews and non-Jews making peace. Now, the world is super divided between Shadal-oriented people of a more liberal orientation and Abarbanel-oriented people of a more conservative orientation. And each one is quite convinced that how they're looking at a particular conflict is the truth, and the other one is either naive or paranoid. Okay? And just to make things a little bit more complex before I open it up, I think about, well, if you were to take historical context, who's right? How many people have talked about this scene of Chamberlain, recently, of Czechoslovakia? And here again, I'm not reading it, but Chamberlain's famous speech saying peace in our time, where he has a peace agreement with Hitler that it's ending in Czechoslovakia. Who does that support? Which worldview, the Abarbanel or Shadal?
Abarbanel.
It supports Abarbanel, which is really, the messengers came and said that he wants peace. He's coming to kill you, right? On the other hand, and then I brought here Anthony Eden, who was the British Foreign Secretary, who said, the hardest thing for me during this time was to convince my friends that Hitler and Mussolini were quite different from British businessmen or country gentlemen as regards their psychology, motivations, and models of action. My friends simply refused to believe me. They thought I was biased against the dictators and refused to understand them. I kept saying, when you converse with the Führer or the Duke, you feel at once that you are dealing with an animal of an entirely different breed from yourself. Anthony Eden resigned, as you know, because he couldn't convince Chamberlain that Hitler actually had ill intent and had no intention of keeping this peace agreement. How come I know that quote? because Bibi Netanyahu quotes it in many, many of his speeches. He is entirely in the Abarbanel mindset, where he quotes Anthony Eden as the realist and everybody being in a Chamberlain bubble. But you could also take the opposite historical context. In 1977, Anwar Sadat landed in Ben Gurion Airport to make a historic visit to the Knesset and to meet with Prime Minister Menachem Begin. But the chief of staff of the Israeli army, Mota Gur, went to the press and said it should be clear to President Sadat that if he's planning another fraud like the Yom Kippur War, his intentions are clear to us. We know the Egyptian army is the peak of preparations to begin a war against Israel by 1978, in spite of Sadat's announcements about willingness to come to Jerusalem. Mota Gur, the chief of the Israeli army, was convinced that this was a Trojan horse. He had snipers ready to shoot down the plane that Sadat was in, because he was convinced that it wasn't Sadat on the plane, it was indeed Egyptian special forces who were going to do a mega terrorist event, kill the prime minister and all the distinguished Israeli delegation that was waiting at the airport, and then declare another war, just like they did in 1973. Because this is the same Sadat who did the Yom Kippur War only 4 or 5 years earlier. And it took Barbara Walters to get on the plane and convince the Israelis that this was actually not a special forces commando unit, but this was actually Sadat. Imagine if Israel had shot down that plane. That, in my mind, is a historic event that supports a Shadal orientation, which is sometimes previous traumas are blinding us from our ability to see that this is actual opportunity of enemies to become friends, of enemies to actually become, to make peace. And if one lives only in their traumas of previous conflicts, they could actually miss important opportunities to make peace. So when I think about today, okay, I will say that that when I engage in the conflict, I find people to be in a Barbanel mindsets or Shadal mindsets. Okay, Shadal mindsets are the ones who are, things can be different, conflicts can be transformed. We can make friends out of enemies. And here's an opportunity. And the world of Abarbanel was a world of the past. And then there are moments, by the way, as soon as when I share this teaching with people that are more liberal oriented, they look at the Abarbanel, especially as soon as they hear that he was influential on Bibi Netanyahu's thinking, they immediately reject it. I once gave this over to a bunch of Israelis, and one of the women in the group started saying, Shadal is clearly not right. There's no 49-49. Abarbanel's correct. That's the simple reading of the text. I said, why? She said, because after the Holocaust, Shadal is no longer relevant. Turns out that woman was not arguing about the Holocaust. I found out afterwards that she was the aunt of one of the 3 boys who had been kidnapped and killed back in 2014. And this was only a couple months after that event. She's not just talking about the Holocaust or about Esau. She's talking about her worldview and her narrative, her context. So, and when you look at, I like to take as an example, Bibi's, you know, if you take an example of his speech that he gave in Congress a few years ago, right? The news are going to report on it in very different ways, right? Israeli leader claims Iran has secret atomic warehouse versus Netanyahu reveals Iran nuclear site, demanding IAEA inspection. You see that even the way the news is being reported is also a function of interpretation. It's a function of different narratives that are happening here. And it shouldn't surprise us that on the left is the New York Times that says he's claiming quote unquote secret warehouse, versus on the right is the Jerusalem Post that the Netanyahu reveals Iran, right? So even what's important here is that in the realities we live in today, especially of social media, there's no longer a biblical text in our conflict. There's no longer even shared facts that these words are there. Instead, we only live with the interpretation, and we don't even know it's interpretation, of what the Abarbanel is saying or what the Shadal is saying. Meaning, as far as we know, that's exactly the way the story happened. The only way to reconstruct the shared facts is if you take two contradictory news sources, the Shadal and the Abarbanel, and say, what do they both agree on? Otherwise, there's absolutely no way to understand what's going on. So I want to leave you, as I want to open up for questions, I'm sorry I went on for so long, with two very important tips in my mind for what's critical for people to be able to engage as insider mediators in general, and in particular the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. First is, we have to push ourselves to read contradictory news. It's really, really painful. I go to sleep reading the New York Times and Haaretz, but I force myself to read Arutz Sheva and Makor Rishon, which are the two right-wing papers, okay? And on Shabbat, we get the right-wing paper and the left-wing paper. It's not simple, okay? If I just took from right now, the website that I like to refer to people called allsides.com, where it gives you from the far right to the far left to center how each news story is being reported on, so that people can get a sense not just of what just happened, but how are different groups interpreting what just happened. That doesn't mean everybody's correct. It means that I need to be critical thinking, because otherwise I could find myself very, very cozily in a 50-0 situation. And if I don't understand what the other news agencies are reporting on, I have very little ability to then be able to engage in working across narrative divides, okay? I won't know the things that they're talking about in terms of the facts that they're presenting or the interpretations of the facts that they're presenting. And the other thing that I want to say is that it's not just enough as a theoretical exercise to read contradictory news. You have to have at least one friend or family member that you could sit on the couch next to and discuss who sees the reality in a different way than you do. After the war in May, I had two members of my team, a rabbi, a right-wing religious Zionist rabbi, and a sheikh from the Islamic movement, do something which we never do. We did an open Zoom to hundreds of university students in Israel. By the way, the Zoom got out, so Palestinians joined, settlers joined, people were all on that Zoom. And I said, I told the two of them, I want you to open up your WhatsApps, meaning our inner WhatsApp, to show to the world how we did this, to show what was actually happening in real time during the war, of how we constantly pushed ourselves to share what's on your social media. Share it. And then let's see what's happening. So just as one example, I don't remember if it was the sheikh shared this picture. This is a picture of a Arab, it seems to be an Arab Palestinian, who is tied up on a car with an Israeli flag. Okay, that's going through the Palestinian social media channels. Everybody's sharing that image. And he writes, this is happening in Akko right now. An Arab is being tied up. And then the rabbi says, actually, that happened in another place. And it was after the social media that's telling me that picture is also going on in my channels, but the interpretation of what just happened is totally different, that he actually just tried killing somebody and they tied him there until the police came. And it didn't happen in Akko. Okay, no one actually knows. And they're going back and forth, arguing about, wait, what's actually happening here? So I bring that as just one little example that picture is like the biblical verse. It's a picture, but we don't understand what is the context. And everybody's passing along in totally different ways. So even if I hear in theory that somebody is seeing it differently, unless if I have a trusted friend who says, actually, this is how people are seeing it on my side, how are people seeing it on your side, my ability to expand from a 50-0 mindset on this moment to 49-49 is going to be much more limited. And one last example is Jerusalem. I think I shared this with you in the first session, that in our social media, we had everybody sharing what was happening from their side. The rabbi sharing about how the Palestinians were preparing to fight against the police that morning of May 10th. And that's what's going on the Jewish social media. On the Palestinian social media, they're showing pictures of the police coming in and storming Al-Aqsa. So everybody's sharing only half of what's going on. So part of our work was, how do we get information, just images, going into different social media contexts? Otherwise, people are going further and further and further into their bubbles, which makes the conflict even more and more extreme. So I want to pause here. I went on and on and on to leave you with those two notions of the importance of pushing ourselves to identify the ambiguity, to try really hard to understand the contradictory ways of looking at it. And this is a tool that I use every single moment. I facilitated two crazy difficult conversations this week. One between two very, very ripe, one moment, I don't want this to be recorded.
I'm taking a perspective of an older person. I think Sadat's bravery and coming, our skepticism in what would happen, were well deserved. And Sadat paid for it with his life. Many times these people who do an about face and try to change their direction pay for it. They're killed.
Rabbi.
And Rabin and other people over the course of our history. And it's a dangerous game. And on both parties, both the population that might be vulnerable and the leader who comes to change course. Number two, you have Zelensky right now deciding that he would talk to Putin, but not in Belarus. You can't be that stupid and naive to say, oh, I'll go into the mouth of the lion and he won't kill me. Belarus is Russia. So he says, I won't meet you in these places. I'll meet you in Warsaw, I'll meet you in Poland, I'll meet you someplace else, but not where you have sway. So neither side should be naive. You should know the history, but you should also understand what potential outcomes could be coming. And to be naive and say, well, we'll just make peace and everything will be fine. I was like that 50 years ago. We could have peace with the Russians if we just treat them nicely. That's where I was from a New York liberal point of view when I was a young woman. But now I look back at this and I have many arguments with Daniel because I take a much more right-wing position. And I think I'm justified because I've lived more and I've seen more. And I have to say to you that peace with the Palestinians is a very complicated issue. I think everybody wants peace, at least I know the Jews do. I don't trust the Palestinians. Number two, I think Zelensky is one of the bravest men on the planet today. And I think that we should learn a lot from him. He's willing to do so much, but not put himself into the mouth of the lion. I think I give Daniel a lot of credit for trying. I love him and he's working hard.
There was a little bit of the familial and professional overlapping there, as we like it here at IKAR. So that's great. Okay, any other questions? I'll throw one out, which is just pedagogically. I mean, you took us through a method of reading Jewish texts, and on some level, you know, like I understand and relate strongly to the basic premise that Jewish texts are filled with debate and ask us to consider different perspectives. But I wonder, you know, how you would respond just as like pedagogically to the critique that, oh, okay, so you have Shadal and you have Abarbanel. So basically, like, you can look at the same Jewish story and come up with whatever worldview you want, and everybody just picks their worldview. And actually, it doesn't really matter whether we use Jewish texts at all. It's just a springboard for us to eventually come to our own political ideology. What do you think of that?
It's a springboard. I think that what it does is challenge our core intuitive worldview. Meaning, my argument pedagogically is that if you have two people sit down, if you just had Abarbanel and Shadal right now, sit down and say, talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's going to go immediately to a place in their brain that they're going to be so locked in that they're not even going to be able to, they will not be able to have a conversation of a 49-49 learning conversation. It's going to just be like talking in two different languages. There are words being exchanged, but no learning happening. If you take people to a conceptual question where the brain can feel not threatened, but relaxed. We're just learning Jewish text. And we're practicing in a certain way, stretching the brain's ability to understand different ways of looking at a conflict story. It can open up that space of, okay, now where do we apply that? Where can we apply that in, can we apply that in understanding what's going on around the Iran nuclear deal? Right? Why is it that some people are saying don't trust and some people are saying you have to trust? Why is that happening? What's happening in their orientation of what text are they looking at? What facts are they looking at? What traumas? Why are Israeli Jews so much more aligned with the Barbanel and American Jews so much more aligned with Shadal? What's happening in their context that's influencing their interpretation of reality today? And that to my mind is tricky. And I think what's important is if people do biblical study or Jewish text study and only write their modern midrash, they're actually doing what I was saying is stage one, the intuitive tweet. They're just seeing the text be a mirror of their own ideology and worldview. What I'm arguing is let's use text study for the purpose of text study, but engage in expanding beyond our comfort zone to seeing how others are looking at the same text in a radically different way that may make us feel uncomfortable. If we're too comfortable with the text, then we're not growing and learning. And I have a certain kind of crazy fantasy that the way like mindfulness was like originally like an Eastern kind of Buddhist thing and now everybody's doing it. I think that there's a certain Jewish wisdom of engaging in hermeneutics, engaging in text, ambiguity, that can train the brain in a way that we need it more than ever because the conflicts in the planet are becoming more textual. Everything is about what's being written on social media, these short little texts.
Right, that's ridiculous.
And the ability to read things critically is becoming incredibly important. When I sit down and I talk to people in conflict, it's not psychological training or legal training or political science training that's helping them. It's textual training, because what you're hearing are different narratives of what just happened in the course of the events. So if you're used to reading, 400 men, what does that mean? Same thing that's happening when two people are telling over their story. What's the interpretation of that? So I'm saying it's actually practical skills that are very much needed, that we're almost do it intuitively as students of text, that's greatly needed to be enhanced through reading contradictory interpretations to be able to engage with the many conflicts, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today. Yes.
Gloria.
Okay, I've heard a great saying, things are not one way or the other. There are many ways at the same time. And I think we're too comfortable in our own bubbles. And that if that continues, nothing will ever change. We're just going to get more into our bunkers and not try and look at the other side, the humanity of the other. And that's my contribution, because I feel like if we're just stuck in our bubbles, what's the point? We'll just keep killing each other. Nothing will ever change if we don't at least try and give it a chance, but not be naive. So that's what I think.
And I want to just add one thing, which is what I love about the 49-49 lens. It's 49-49, then vote. Meaning you have to take a stand. It's not 49-49, everybody's right, and then shrug your shoulders. It's 49-49, then take a vote. But you have to express your opinion, but you're going to do it after you've been aware of the strengths, but also somewhat weaknesses of your argument, and you know the strengths and weaknesses of the other way of looking at it. But the best way to be able to make this a practice and to actually solve problems is to invest in having that one friend or relative that it could be, if you're a rabbi, then a parallel rabbi, or an educator, a lawyer, having somebody who has their own web of relationships. This goes back to what I was saying about insider mediation. Everybody has their web of relationships, their areas of influence. And the question is, if you have the same way we work with a rabbi and a sheikh from the extremes, they're the mediators. That if one gets that information, he can then share it in the way he knows best or she knows best with their channels. Okay, it's much more believable than if it's just something they read in the news. So the ability, when we had to pass on information of, there's a militia coming to your mosque, no, that's fake news. That's trusted information going back and forth between people that are seeing totally different bubbles. It's breaking that bubble. And I think each of us can do that within our own context, within our community, within our families. And I think that it's a culture of what's happening globally that we have to be part of a counterculture to that.
Okay. I think that's probably a good point to end on.
Wait, I have to do one text about the Ukrainians to end. One final text. I'm sorry.
Please.
I can't not share one final thing as a word of as a point of here. The very last quote of my book.
I don't think we're seeing it.
Oh no! Again with this. Here we go. Very last quote of my book. I talk about the Jewish imperative to not only deal with conflicts and mediating conflicts within the community, but also on a global level. And I bring the statement of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai from the time of the destruction of the temple, who said, the peacemaker has to make peace between individuals, between families, between cities, and then he said, even between governments and between nations. And a Yemenite Jewish rabbi from about 100 years ago, Rabbi Ibn Adhan, writes, he said, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's statements provides an answer to the nations of the world who say that the people of Israel do not seek their peace and well-being. For it explicitly wants to state that to the nations of the world, that the nation of Israel loves peace and pursues peace with all people. And may we be granted the ability to make peace between warring kings and for there to be peace in the world. For then we would sell our household possessions so that we would be declared, and the land has rest from war. And nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. That here you have this Jew living in Yemen saying, I wish we could help make peace between warring kings and warring nations. And I want to just take that as a charge, as a call, as a prayer, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it seems overwhelming. It's a huge conflict. The world conflicts can seem huge, but I hope that each of us can take a little bit from the learning that we've done to A, find a bit of inspiration that there are things happening behind the scenes, and B, that each of us can do in our own context to play a little bit of that role of an insider mediator, trying to understand the ambiguity and help people understand opposing truths and actually try to get together and solve problems. So thank you once again.
Amen. That we'll take that charge. And thank you so much. I mean, just want to end on a note of great gratitude for taking us on this journey and deepening our ability to read conflict and sensitizing us to some of the nuances that we never have the ability to appreciate. And then here at the end, empowering us a little bit to try and think about our own part in thinking constructively towards a more peaceful world. So thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for being here. And you can catch up on earlier parts of the series. And I'm sure we'll have Rabbi Roth back to teach for us again. It's such a blessing. Thank you, everybody.
All the best. Look forward to seeing you in Jerusalem one day.